The African fish eagle is one of the most charismatic birds in Africa, where it is the quintessential flagship of African lakes and rivers. My name is Munir Virani, and I've been studying these magnificent eagles at Lake Naivasha for over 20 years. As a young boy, I remember Lake Naivasha having crystal clear waters, a pristine habitat that supported a spectacular array of wildlife that included tens of thousands of birds. Growing up, I recall how the geothermal and horticultural industry expanded, leading to an increase in humans as well as excessive water use. These activities affected the health of the lake through organic pollution, overfishing, and destruction of habitat, placing the lake under critical life support and affecting its wildlife. This story is about how the African fish eagles are coping with the pressures caused by man.
The future of Lake Naivasha is not visible.
Birds or fish will tell you that there's something good or bad happening.
I would say the lake at the moment is quite under a lot of pressure.
We get money from fish eagles, so we value fish eagles at every time.
They are very tolerant of human activity.
There's many problems that these poor fish eagles have to deal with.
Whilst habitat loss affected fish eagle density, one invasive species had already caused havoc on the lake, and the fish eagles were not spared.
It's a destructive beast and should be eradicated.
If there's any creature that has caused irreparable damage to Lake Naivasha's ecology, then it's this little guy over here. He looks small and he looks harmless. This is the Louisiana crayfish. It was introduced in the early 1970s to enhance the fisheries of the lake, but boy, did they cause havoc.
The Louisiana crayfish, for instance, has eaten out all the submerged macrophytes, the underwater greenery. Without that, the coot, the small black coot, no longer is here in the numbers that it used to be. And that means that with the turbidity, the fish eagles can't see the fish. So their next favourite dinner is a nice little coot, and that's pushed off because there's no greenery. And they're actually in trouble, despite the fact there are so many around here.
Crayfish has a very good market in China. Chinese people like crayfish. And this year, the county government was trying to engage a few people to export crayfish to China.
The combination of an overfished lake with very few water birds meant that the African fish eagles had very little to eat.
In 1996, the African fish eagle population at Lake Naivasha had reached its all-time low of 67 individuals. That was a drop of 75% of when Leslie Brown did his studies in the late 1960s. The lake at that time was also completely overfished. The fish eagles were barely sustaining themselves, let alone get into breeding condition. We then started a banding program to understand how these fish eagles were surviving and whether this lake was acting as a dying field for these magnificent eagles.
Our banding studies showed us that African fish eagles spent an enormous amount of time fighting one another. And at least 15% of the dead birds that we found were killed by other eagles to maintain their territories that were highly contested.
Well, the biggest threat of any species is its own species. If you have a whole load of lions around here, you can bet your boots you're going to be getting a whole load of injured lions from fighting and territorial disputes. And eagles are no different. There's no doubt that there seems to be a huge increase in the number of attacks made on each other.
At the moment have a real problem releasing birds because there are so many birds on this lake, there's no spare territory. And if I were to release a bird now, it'd probably be killed straight away because there's nowhere for it to go.
The frequency of fish eagle fights increased as their population went up by 40% following heavy rains and a rise in water level in the year 2000. And ironically, it was yet another invasive species that helped the fish eagles recover.
As the lake water level rose, this guy over here, the common carp, found his way accidentally into the lake. For the very first time, Lake Naivasha had a bottom-feeding fish, one that stirs up the sediments, that eats all the submerged plants, and destroys the nests and eats the eggs of other spawning fish. This carp over here caused havoc. He's huge, but the fish eagles love them.
Because the carp are bottom-feeding fish, a number of scientists began to record alarming levels of heavy metals concentrating in the carp.
I was looking at the concentrations of cadmium, copper and lead in surface sediments, water and the mussels of common carp at different sampling points within the lake. The most striking result was that in fish mussels, lead was 100 times higher than what is recommended for consumption.
And where did all this lead come from?
Many years ago in the 1940s, there was a lead mine above Gilgil, quite a flourishing lead mine. And the owners of the lead mine every day flushed everything down the Gilgil River, and that ended up in the lake.
So what does high levels of lead in the fish, water and sediments mean for the people living around the lake?
It is said that high levels can cause bone defects, they can affect reproduction, and they can also generally be carcinogenic, affect nervous system, etc. These are just some of the effects related to this. So health-wise, this is what the impact will be. In terms of socioeconomics, we know that common carp constitutes over 90% of the fishery in Lake Naivasha. So when people realize the effects of what they are consuming, then they will seek alternative fish to consume. And this will affect the fishermen in terms of earning from their livelihoods from fishing activities within the lake.
Heavy metals were not the only industrial pollutant that caused concern. With the flourishing flower industry now well established along the shore, the public wanted to know where the harmful pesticides were ending up in the lake.
This one affects our community because they throw some chemicals to the lake.
One such pesticide was DDT, which was banned in Kenya in 1986. But pressure mounts for its use for malaria control. DDT causes eggshell thinning in birds of prey, causing eggs to be more brittle, and so fewer chicks survive.
Lake Naivasha is, kind of a hub for floriculture and horticulture activities, and so there's been a lot of concern over, you know, how those practices are run and whether they're affecting the lake and the biodiversity around it.
The horticultural activity, we don't know what they're putting in the lake. Could be all kinds of pollutants affecting eggshell thickness, etc., development of chicks.
Nobody wants to believe it, but I still think it's going on. The larger flower farmers, many of them don't use those type of chemicals, and they are concerned about the lake. But unfortunately, they're lumped in with everybody else. There are the irresponsible ones as well as the responsible ones.
I cannot really criticize or comment so much on pesticides finding their way into the lake. Most of these flower farms really takes care of what gets back into the lake, and I really commend some of them.
It was not surprising that there was, you know, we found DDT as well in all of the samples that were collected and analyzed at Lake Naivasha. So that could have been because there was still some leakage from somewhere, or someone was still using DDT in the environment, or it could have still been residues left over from past uses.
How did these levels of DDT in Masumi's samples compare to what is acceptable by World Health Organization standards?
Luckily, the samples that we analyzed of the fish eagle blood was nowhere near what it used to be in terms of causing eggshell thinning and impairing reproductivity. They were very sort of low levels that were found, but I guess the concern is that when you start having lots of these chemicals that are being concentrated in one species over a long time, there could be other, you know, issues manifesting that we wouldn't know until much later.
The fact that African fish eagles are regularly producing chicks at Lake Naivasha suggests that organochlorine pesticides such as DDT are not a problem at Lake Naivasha today. But are there still new pesticides in use today that are harming the lake?
I know that there have been such concerns over the years, but most of them, like you said when you're asking that question, is that they are unsubstantiated. What happens is that the flower industry is a very visible thing in Naivasha, and as such has become a very good punching bag. You know, anything that happens, then you can always blame it on this good punching bag that you can hit anytime. But that actually is changing over the years when people and also scientists like yourselves have come and done researches here, and they have found that some of those allegations are not founded at all.
In the year 2010, after the worst drought in 60 years, Naivasha's health was in critical condition. There was public outcry for the Kenyan government to step in. So they launched Project Imarisha, a beacon of hope where everyone for whom the lake mattered got together to ensure the future survival of Lake Naivasha.
Imarisha is a government initiative which was started in 2011. And the purpose of Imarisha Naivasha was to initiate a sustainable development program within the Lake Naivasha basin.
Local NGOs helped mobilize the community.
Well, since the mid-90s, WWF has been working in the basin, working specifically with communities, so developing governance, water governance with the communities and natural resource management. And what we do is we provide them with support, like financial support, through the buying of seedlings, for tree seedlings, as well as Napier or cocksfoot grass for contouring. And then we also train them through the Ministry of Agriculture on how to actually develop the contours, maintain the contours, and manage their farms better. So this way we have reduced the amount of soil erosion. We are starting to see very good change in water quality and livelihoods, of course, is the PES, the Payment for Ecosystem Services Scheme. Now that was started and was initially supported quite well by the Lake Naivasha Growers Group. And without them, we wouldn't have had this success story.
Even private industry got into the act.
Over the years, what LNGG and various growers have done, we've been trying to adopt good agricultural practices. And apart from that, also, we've been looking at our way of using pesticides and treatment of water. Most of the growers now have adopted closed system hydroponics, which means that any excess water in the greenhouse is usually recycled for reuse. And as such, there is no runoff or any pesticide that come out of the greenhouses into the environment. Our core business is to look at the sustainability of the industry in this area. And when you talk about sustainability, we must talk about environmental care and conservation efforts to ensure that we're not depleting the natural resources that we're using at a rate that we don't use them at a rate that is not sustainable.
And that matters to the next generation more than anybody.
Tell me what is different from here in your home or school?
In this place, there are a lot of animals, wild animals.
One of our big success stories is creating conducive environment for learning in schools through eco school projects, whereby environmental clubs in schools try to nurture green patches in their schools, small habitats for birds, small habitats for small animals and insects, for them to enjoy, that is one, and something else for them to interact with nature, to know how they need to relate with nature. And lastly, for their teachers to use the outdoor as a learning tool.
Do you feel you're creating future conservationists, future leaders in conservation?
Yes, I believe that we are creating future leaders because with the current schooling system, it's whereby children are now being given leadership roles. Usually in schools now there are presidents and there are secretaries and they are able to. Children are now exercising their leadership roles in school, which I believe when the transition is progressive enough to high school and universities, there'll be better future leaders who are able to influence decision making and they're able to lobby for their rights.
Does the lake have a future?
Everybody asks, despite all the pressures, the fish eagles are doing well currently. They've gone through ups and downs. Despite all the pressures of water abstraction, human population growth, industry, the industrial park coming through, the SGR and everything. Does Lake Naivasha have a future?
It does need a lot of people who care to fight for it, or we will lose it.
I would imagine here in the next 50 years or so that Lake Naivasha will still exist in some form, and nature is incredibly resilient. It will find its way.
I don't see the future. It doesn't look bright. I expect in 50 years, even if the lake will be there, it will be very much polluted.
It is very possible that my grandchildren will still see Lake Naivasha. But there is need for, a lot of effort in conservation, in awareness creation, in restoration program.
The future is very uncertain, I'm afraid. I don't think the lake will ever come back to what it was in the 60s and 70s. I think those days are gone.
Lake Naivasha's future is in our hands. We as the people living around the lake, conservationists, scientists, policymakers.
I think so, because over the last 30 years, the species composition in all facets of this lake, all the fish, all the water plants, etc., they're all invasive and they've changed the lake hugely. This lake used to be crystal clear, but now it's turbid, you can't see below the surface, and that's as a result of crayfish and carp coming in and such. So one could argue that the lake is at its worst condition possible, but the eagles and wildlife is doing rather well in the places which are protected.
During the making of this film, both lake levels and numbers of carp were up. And in my 20 years of study, I had never seen so many fish eagles as I did in 2016. They obviously had a lot of food to eat and a community that loved them, and that's why they were thriving.
So the numbers of eagles have more than doubled to about 240. And that goes back to the numbers recorded by Leslie Brown in the 60s and 70s. So the lake is at carrying capacity for the eagles, and they're doing fantastically well. Most pairs have 2 or 3 juveniles.
The future of Lake Naivasha and its people, and indeed of the fish eagles, hangs precariously in the balance.
Perhaps the eagles will still be here 20 years from now, their evocative call shattering the dawn silence. But for now, the eagles are doing well. High water levels have brought in an abundance of fish, and there is still good nesting habitat. But what gives us greatest hope is the goodwill of the local people to save the lake. But as man continues to exert more pressure on this lake, the eagles will have to find new ways to adapt. Lake Naivasha is not just a place of beauty or a place of financial gain. It is a place of inspiration, a place of hope, a place where man and eagle must come together to use the lake wisely.